A wonderful, caring person, very giving, and very determined to go out of his way to help make people feel better.
Max Jacobson has always been a fascinating figure to me, and it does represent the whole issue of how patients choose doctors and whether or not choosing one's doctor, which is so big in our society, is all that's cracked up to be. Because a lot of people choose very famous doctors who don't know what the f*** they're doing.
It was saddening to read that page-one expose of my old childhood doctor. The New York Times said Manhattan general practitioner Max Jacobson had been injecting amphetamine, the powerful stimulant known as speed, into celebrity patients to boost their mood or energy, not to treat disease. President John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy got countless shots from Jacobson, such a White House intimate that he was invited on a family 50-mile hike and to the historic 1961 Vienna summit meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. In fact, Jacobson's A-list of patients was an international who's who of the 20th century. In Hollywood, filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille, Marilyn Monroe, Betty Davis, Marlene Dietrich, Anthony Quinn, Edward G. Robinson. Writers Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams. Artist Andy Warhol. Singers Judy Garland, Eddie Fisher, Andy Williams, Johnny Mathis. Other figures in music from Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones to jazz great Maynard Ferguson and classical pianist Van Cliburn. Theatrical luminaries like lyricist-composer Alan J. Lerner, Carol Channing, Zero Mostel, Yul Brynner. In fashion, Emilio Pucci. In sportscasting, Mel Allen and Howard Cosell. In political affairs, Winston Churchill, Nelson Rockefeller, Florida Congressman Claude Pepper, and big-money Democrat Nathan Lichtblau, who slipped some of Jacobson's miracle vitamin drops to a second president, Harry S. Truman. The government of Panama decorated Jacobson in 1966 for public service, the Associated Press photo caption identifying him as Kennedy's medical advisor and physician to many of America's celebrated personalities. Many patients swore by Jacobson with his brusque and forceful self-certainty, lauding him as Miracle Max.
The secret ingredient in Max's medicine was Max. Very funny and very smart and completely convincing. Somehow Max made people believe anything was possible.
But there was a second opinion, that he enslaved people and ruined lives. Bob Richardson, a top fashion photographer, said he went berserk after 3 years of addicting speed shots and spent 2 years in a mental hospital. Said Richardson, "I was a victim of bad medicine." Filmmaker Otto Preminger said Jacobson's needles gave him one of the most fearful experiences of my life. Some patients were bitter in their memoirs. Hugh Martin, the composer of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, recalled,
"He told me they were liquid vitamins. I never knew I was on heavy drugs for 10 years. It nearly killed me."
In Quinn's autobiography, he called Jacobson underhanded and an evil man. Perhaps most damaging in the Times expose, the prominent photographer Mark Shaw, a Kennedy confidant and a devoted Jacobson patient for 23 years, had died at age 47 in 1969 of what the New York City Medical Examiner concluded was acute and chronic intravenous amphetamine poisoning. At age 72, after nearly 50 years in practice, the high-flying Jacobson suddenly faced a stepped-up New York State investigation. A petition to revoke his medical license charged him with unprofessional conduct and fraud or deceit in the practice of medicine. The charismatic Dr. Max plummeted, becoming a historical footnote with a lasting nickname, Dr. Feelgood. Some 40 years later, Jacobson is still often pilloried as a reckless quack mainly for his involvement with the secretly sickly President Kennedy at dangerous junctures in the Cold War. At least 16 books have condemned Jacobson's eccentric ways. Ruth Mossy, a one-time nurse in his office, described the sometimes rumpled doctor to author C. David Heyman this way.
Max was totally off the wall. Absolutely a quack. Out of his mind.
In another book, physician Bert Park called Jacobson's chemical practices sordid. Park equated Jacobson with Adolf Hitler's infamous speed doctor, the quack Theodor Morell. Seymour Hersh noted constant friction among Jacobson and other Kennedy doctors who were deeply suspicious of him. To Kennedy biographer Lawrence Leamer, Jacobson was a sinister figure, his magical syringe enhanced by a mystical knowing aura and psychological astuteness. Max Jacobson retained no records of whether he actually laced Kennedy's shots with amphetamines, but writer Frederick Kempe speculated that secret, excessive, and perhaps irresponsible speed treatments may have impaired Kennedy's judgment at that tense Vienna summit, encouraging Khrushchev to build the Berlin Wall. Dr. Jacobson is in the 2011 TV series The Kennedys as a heel-clicking German who hooks the first couple on his risky serums.
Can't live like this.
Well, I know people call me Dr. Feelgood. I'm not insulted by this. I want my patients to feel good.
How long until it takes effect?
Before I'm out the gate, Mr. President.
There were other Dr. Feelgoods. Like Jacobson, Robert Freeman and John Bishop had fashionable Upper East Side offices with celebrity patients. The New York Times quoted one former patient as saying some thrill-seekers went to all three doctors in one night, as just another kind of bar hopping. Freeman was patronized by jazz stars Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, and by Warhol film star Edie Sedgwick. Bishop treated LSD guru Timothy Leary and the Broadway cast of Hair, led by producer Michael Butler. In 1966, the Beatles recorded the Lennon-McCartney song Dr. Robert. It was about Freeman, though the Beatles were not patients. Paul McCartney explained in 1968, the song was a joke about this fellow who cured everyone of everything with these pills and tranquilizers. He just kept New York high. Aretha Franklin wrote and sang the hit song Dr. Feelgood, a term that entered the American culture. Glamorized by the elite New York doctors, amphetamines spread in the 1950s and 60s to truck drivers, dieting housewives, students cramming for exams. Mood-altering amphetamines became so overproduced and abused that the inevitable backlash put an end to the open Dr. Feelgood era.
These papers love to come crashing down on you and jump all over you, but they never really sit back and ask, hey, why?
Many of the physicians who ran into problems with the new speed limits came from Europe. Max Jacobson was born in 1900 in Fordon, now in Poland, but then in German East Prussia, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Jacobson was the second of the three sons of Joseph Jacobson, a kosher butcher, and his wife Esther. They were among 2,000 Jews in Fordon, a river town with a 17th century synagogue. As a youth, Jacobson experienced the German hardships of World War I and its aftermath of hunger, uprisings, and the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. Young Max attended the University of Heidelberg, then studied medicine at Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin, where he did some boxing on the side, losing half a tooth in one fight. He was practicing medicine in Prague in 1925 when he married a woman named Alice. In 1930, they moved back to the tumultuous Berlin of the Weimar Republic, where their son Thomas was born in 1931. Fatefully, Jacobson soon met the beautiful young Nina Hagen, daughter and granddaughter of wealthy bankers. One of the first German Jews to emigrate after Hitler took power, Max Jacobson moved with his family to Paris in 1933. Through a family connection of his young friend Nina Hagen with Baron Gottfried von Cramm, star of the 1934 German Davis Cup tennis team, Jacobson, despite being Jewish, was named medical consultant to the national team for matches in France. Jacobson's friend Cramm was honored by Hitler, but the doctor sensed he had no future in Europe. Albert Einstein, Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, and other prominent Germans were fleeing to the United States, and on July 22, 1936, Max, Alice, and Tommy Jacobson followed, embarking on the French line's SS Champlain. In New York, under the shadow of the airship Hindenburg with its swastika emblem, Jacobson applied for permanent residence. Only 3 months after arriving, he passed the demanding examination for a New York State medical license. Jacobson set up practice. His early interests were eye disorders and infectious hepatitis, but his scientific goal was to experiment with unconventional research he called tissue regeneration therapy.
He wanted to find a cure for cancer. He wanted to find a treatment and cure for multiple sclerosis. And he wanted to help make people feel better, and he wanted to help people become more productive in their lives.
Before long, he turned to 2 chemicals he considered to be nerve regenerators, dextroamphetamine sulfate and intravenous methamphetamine hydrochloride. The father of amphetamine, biochemist Gordon Alice, patented the chemical in 1932 as a synthetic adrenaline that stimulated the central nervous system and elevated moods and alertness. Smith, Kline, and French marketed the drug as Benzedrine. The stronger dextroamphetamine, or dexedrine, followed in 1939. Methamphetamine was introduced in 1943 as Dasoxin. Pervitin, the German version, was what Hitler got from Dr. Morell. Luftwaffe pilots took Pervitin to stay sharp in combat, while American flyers downed Benzedrine. World War II U.S. troops took 200 million amphetamine and methadrine tablets. It did not take long for cases of damaging addiction to surface. Dr. Jacobson stuck with amphetamines. By 1941, Jacobson's elixirs and his commanding manner were bringing him a clientele from high-stress Broadway, including producers Saint Suber and John Murray Anderson. Performing artists flocked to him, led by dancer-choreographer Katherine Dunham.
They had to rehearse. They had show openings. People had to rewrite scripts. Like Alan Lerner had one deadline after another, my God. So my father helped him.
In 1941, Jacobson was divorced from Alice and married the 27-year-old Nina Hagen. Dr. Jacobson became a U.S. citizen in 1943. In 1944, as the New York Times noted then, he moved his practice to the handsome pre-war building at 155 East 72nd Street. Always a generous man, Jacobson did not abandon the persecuted left behind in Europe. His bank reported him to the U.S. State Department in 1946. Jacobson had been volunteering financial sponsorship to Europeans stranded all over the world who were applying for U.S. visas, financial commitments that the bank said Jacobson could not meet because he never had more than $1,500 in his account. Jacobson came to the rescue of a 16-year-old concentration camp survivor named Jack Garfine, restoring the boy to health, paying for his lodging. He was really just amazing, recalls Garfine, who became a noted film director and acting coach. Through Jacobson's street door in the 40s and 50s came admirers who spread his reputation. A physician named Herman Bundesen praised Jacobson in a nationally syndicated article for his purported regime of injections of amino acids and vitamins. Dr. Bundesen may not have known it, but often there was more than just amino acids and vitamins in the solutions Jacobson pushed into buttocks and arms. The basic formula he called the IV special included hormones, vitamins A, B complex, C, D, and E, Novocaine or Procaine, calcium, human placenta from hospitals, enzymes and steroids, mixed with 20 to 55 milligrams of methamphetamine.
You feel like Superman. You're flying. Ideas come at the speed of light. You go 72 hours straight without so much as a coffee break. You don't need sleep. You don't need nourishment. If it's sex you're after, you go all night. Then you crash. You go running back to East 72nd Street. You're looking for the German mosquito, the insect with the magic pinprick. He stings you, and all at once, you're soaring again.
Truman Capote. Word of the euphoria from the miracle tissue regenerator shots brought new waves of clients to Jacobson's waiting room. When Betty Davis developed an infected larynx in 1952 and could not open in a play, Jacobson was quoted as her doctor in the New York Times theatrical column. That drew Metropolitan Opera stars like Leontine Price, though it was hard to get an appointment. You had to know somebody. Yul Brynner of The King and I touted Jacobson to DeMille. DeMille, who died in 1959 owing Jacobson $38,000 in unpaid bills, took him to Egypt in 1954 when he made the Ten Commandments. DeMille recommended the doctor to his daughter, Catherine DeMille. She brought in her husband, Anthony Quinn. Quinn brought in Alan J. Lerner.
When I was a teenager, I was a patient of Max. I remember the office so well because I went there frequently for this acne treatment, and it was really a wild place. He had a number of different treatment rooms, and he'd go running between treatment rooms, often had a syringe in his hand while he's going from one room to the other.
He had so many patients, it was unbelievable. He didn't even have time for all of them. They had to wait hours and hours in the waiting room for him.
Jacobson was working virtually around the clock, injecting himself to test his concoctions and to keep up with his patients.
Oh yeah, he had to guinea pig the stuff on himself first before he would give it to anyone else. I would see him trying to find a vein a few times, and it didn't upset him. He just sat there trying.
Jacobson's nurses used a grapefruit to teach up to 90% of the patients how to inject themselves at home and on the road, using vials of the unlicensed, homemade mixture the doctor would ship worldwide. New York State authorities eventually found that in one 5-year period, Jacobson ordered at least 40 pounds of amphetamines, enough for thousands of doses a year. As composer Hugh Martin said, many of Jacobson's patients were never told what was in those pep-me-up shots. Whenever Catherine DeMille asked about it, Anthony Quinn wrote, the doctor would tell her, "You're feeling better, correct? Then that is all you need to know."
If somebody asked him, what is in here? He would say, if I told you, would you know what I'm talking about? No, because he's been so educated. He spent so many years studying this stuff. He knows what the stuff is.
Some patients, including Alan J. Lerner's assistant, Doris Shapiro, were given all the facts.
The doctor himself was quite open about the methadone. By itself, it was called speed, the dreaded speed. The kids who used it for thrills were holding a loaded gun. But prepared by the master, it became the privileged treatment we had just experienced. We felt wonderful.
Marty Stevens, cabaret singer and actress.
He did say they were vitamins, but you couldn't not know. Everybody who went to Max Jacobson, and everybody did, knew better than that.
Jacobson was to tell the New York Times, "I am not just amphetamines." He cited his interest in multiple sclerosis and other nerve-degenerating maladies such as Lou Gehrig's disease. Jacobson devoted every Tuesday to treating up to 400 such patients, mostly for free.
He would call people to bring people in that had MS so he could treat them and experiment. He thought he was on the road to finding a cure for them.
Jacobson's Research Foundation for MS acknowledged that his central concept, regenerative therapy, was a departure from the well-trodden paths of conventional medical thinking. One patient and fan, Michael J. Samek, described Jacobson as a futurist and a medical anarchist who disdained establishment doctors. My aunt Mildred Kassendorf, who had had polio as a child, was a patient of Dr. Jacobson. She brought in her older sister, Susie Gabler, the grandmother of Billy Crystal. He jokes that Susie would come home so high from Jacobson's shots, she would make 9 pot roasts in an hour. When my twin brother and I were diagnosed as anemic at age 11 in 1951, we were taken to visit Jacobson, too, on East 72nd Street. Today, my brother has vivid memories of those 3 years of speedless B12 shots and vitamin capsules.
We were very anemic. We were very probably malnourished, very small for our age. We weren't growing. We went there to get treated so that we could grow. The first thing you see is a receptionist at the desk and a whole bunch of people, famous-looking people sitting in chairs, waiting, it seems, for hours and hours without complaint to see the doctor. Everybody who worked there were German Jews. They had German accents. And I remember the phone ringing, and this lady always answered the phone, "Dr. Jacobson's office?" First thing I thought about him was what a big, strong, good-looking guy he was. He was about 6 feet tall with thick black glasses, black rimmed glasses, black hair, kind of swept back in a very European manner, an extremely magnetic and dynamic guy.
A kindly guy, too. In 1955, we were living in Los Angeles when Dr. Max introduced us to DeMille at Paramount Studios. He cast us as extras in the mass exodus scenes of the Ten Commandments.
Do you hear that? Do you hear that?
You have a strong new son.
Eddie Fisher started with Jacobson in 1953. In a 1999 memoir dealing largely with their relationship, Fisher describes how a 37-year speed habit began after he sang for screaming teenagers at New York's Paramount Theater.
I was singing loudly, trying to be heard above the screams, and my vocal cords were inflamed. The great songwriter and pianist Hugh Martin, who was my accompanist, said, "I've got a doctor who will bring back your voice just like that." He snapped his fingers. The office looked more like a chemist's laboratory than a doctor's office, and Max looked like Max, a mad scientist.
He said, "Pull down your pants, roll up your sleeve." He gave me a shot in the arm and shot here, and he said, "Now sing." And my voice came back, and I said, "This is for me for life."
What I did not know was that Max vitamin cocktail was in fact a mix of vitamins, calcium, and methamphetamine. Speed. In those days, that stuff was not only legal, nobody really knew what it was. It was medicine, wonderful medicine, and Max was a genius. In fact, as I later learned, many of his patients referred to him affectionately as Dr. Feelgood, the original.
I think it's outrageous for somebody that was that well educated, that had been through the war, that had done so much for so many, that had helped so many people, to be called that. It's an insult.
He deserved the name of Dr. Feelgood because that's what some of his patients called him, and that's what he made them feel like.
Jacobson never lived lavishly, but he did lease a Chrysler in which his younger brother, Simon Jacobson, chauffeured him around New York. On summer weekends, the doctor joined Nina and little Jill at their Point Lookout, Long Island beach house. In 1956, his prestige unquestioned, Jacobson co-authored an article on hepatitis treatment in the New York State Journal of Medicine. He got bylines on general health issues in the Reader's Digest, Argosy, and the American Mercury. In 1958, Jacobson played a role behind the scenes in a bright moment of the Cold War, Texas pianist Van Cliburn's triumph in Moscow's Tchaikovsky competition.
Cliburn called him every day from Moscow to get reassurance. I believe he had influence over people completely aside from medication. I think he had the ability to calm people, to inspire people, and I think that the way he treated celebrities, they needed to be treated. You know, it's like giving them a slap. Stop the nonsense. Get to work.
September 1960. Senator John F. Kennedy was complaining of fatigue from the grueling presidential campaign. Chuck Spaulding, a New York investment banker, told his friend that Jacobson's magic potion had sent Spaulding over the top of the building. Mark Shaw, married at the time to Broadway star Pat Suzuki, seconded the endorsement. Shortly before Kennedy's first televised debate with Richard Nixon, Jacobson discreetly at his office gave Kennedy a shot he said would relieve stress. Kennedy said his muscle weakness had disappeared, and the candidate debated well. May 12, 1961. The president urgently summoned Jacobson to the family estate in Palm Beach, Florida. Jackie was complaining of depression and migraine headaches since John Jr.'s birth in November 1960. Kennedy worried that his wife might not join him on a state visit to Canada or on the big trip in June to Paris and the Vienna summit. The Dominican maid Providencia Paredes escorted Jacobson to examine Jackie. The doctor said later that his shots cured Jackie's migraines and ended doubts she could endure the foreign trips. May 23rd. A call from the White House to Jacobson using the agreed code name Mrs. Dunn for the president. Mark Shaw, a decorated World War II pilot, flew Jacobson to Washington in his Cessna 310. Instructed to publicly carry an attaché case instead of a physician's bag, Jacobson saw Jackie in her bedroom. She was anxious about getting through the strenuous schedule in Europe. He treated her, though he never specified how. Then the president, lying on his bed, told Jacobson that while ceremonially planting a tree in Ottawa on May 18th, he had badly aggravated his old back condition from the 1943 sinking of PT-109. He wanted no back trouble and no crutches in Paris and Vienna. Jacobson delivered an injection that seemed to give relief. Kennedy then invited Max and Nina to Europe as his guests the following week. Air Force One was idling for takeoff at New York's Idlewild Airport when Jacobson hustled aboard to give the suffering president a last requested pain relief shot before the long flight. Max and Nina flew to Paris as the only passengers on an Air France flight that may have been chartered for them by the White House. In Paris, Jacobson's private treatments of Jack and Jackie at the luxurious Palais d'Orsay state guest chambers may have helped ease the first couple triumphantly through appearances with President Charles de Gaulle. Dr. Max at last made it onto Air Force One to Vienna. In fact, he was seated across the aisle from Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Reaching the U.S. ambassador's residence, Kennedy told Jacobson that Soviet leader Khrushchev was due any minute for a long first summit session. "I can't afford any complications with my back," the president said. "You won't have that for an excuse," Jacobson said, and gave the president another shot. Jacobson waited outside the meeting, then asked the emerging Kennedy how he was feeling. Kennedy peevishly said, "I'm fine. Do you mind if I take time for a piss?" Next day it was Khrushchev's turn to host Kennedy at the Soviet embassy. The Kennedys then flew to London, where Jacobson treated them again at the home of Jackie's sister Lee Radziwill and her husband, Polish Prince Stanislas Radziwill. Some commentators, including Michael Beschloss and Bert Park, say there's no evidence amphetamines had any effect on Kennedy's summit performance. But author Barbara Leeming, on the never-proven assumption that Kennedy got amphetamines in Vienna, called the effects catastrophic. Quoting Charles Bolin, a former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, Leeming said Kennedy abandoned his usual caution and got out of his depth in ideological discussions with the bullying Khrushchev.
It may well have altered Kennedy's behavior during the summit and may have contributed to the Soviet Union's deciding they could go ahead and put missiles into Cuba.
The Jacobsons visited the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport on Cape Cod, where the doctor gave Kennedy shots to relax him during the Berlin Wall crisis, while Nina and Jill met Jackie and daughter Caroline Kennedy. The records of Presidential Secretary Evelyn Lincoln and Social Secretary Letitia Baldridge and White House gate logs confirm that Dr. Jacobson saw the President or the First Lady no fewer than 34 times through May 1962, as often as 3 or 4 times a week. Max Jacobson had become a White House regular, the chemical Merlin of Kennedy's Camelot. In September 1961, after United Nations Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was killed in an African plane crash, Jacobson gave Kennedy an emergency shot straight into the throat for laryngitis at the Carlisle Hotel in New York. Jacobson said the shot allowed Kennedy to speak at the UN General Assembly against a Soviet initiative. Kennedy took Jacobson to the UN in his motorcade. 2 months later, enabling Kennedy to sit through the historic 3-hour Pablo Casals cello concert at the White House, Jacobson gave him the Vienna treatment again. In May 1962, Shaw flew Jacobson to Jackie's equestrian retreat at the Glen Ora Estate in Virginia to treat the Kennedys there. Jacobson paid visits to Kennedy frequently during the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and at other moments of tension. Dr. Jacobson took on the JFK entourage as patients: Prince Stash Radziwill, brother-in-law Peter Lawford, fashion designer Oleg Cassini, presidential friend Lem Billings, later even the president's girlfriend, Judy Campbell, whom Kennedy shared with Sam Giancana of the Chicago Mafia. For Jacobson, a high point establishing his status with the Kennedys was the 50-mile hike in February 1963 along the Sunshine State Parkway in Florida. The president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, previously had done a 50-mile fitness hike in 18 hours. The president bet Radziwill and Spaulding that neither man could make the distance. The party set out before dawn, Jacobson walking south with Radziwill, Mark Shaw, Spaulding, Secret Service agent Clint Hill, and a Navy medical corpsman. At the halfway point, the president drove up to encourage the tiring hikers. Shaw photographed Kennedy with Jacobson and the others. The doctor revived Prince Radziwill with oxygen and at least one hypodermic injection. The blistered hikers finished in 19.5 hours. Shaw wrote later, "As always, Dr. Max was everybody's good friend and insisted on treating everyone in sight." Back in Palm Beach, Kennedy awarded mock medals made of crepe paper and tea bags, and we see Jacobson again. A month later, the president's father, Joseph Kennedy, and his sister, Eunice Shriver, donated $2,000 to Jacobson's research foundation to settle bets on the hike. Not everyone at the White House felt goodwill toward Jacobson and his hypodermics. Secret Service agent Larry Newman said the agent stared at Jacobson stonily, addressed him disrespectfully, and checked his bag as if looking for a gun, just to give him a hard time. "It's in the air, like between animals," Newman told biographer Barbara Leeming. He knew we didn't like him. Jacobson feuded over amphetamines with Janet Travell and other Kennedy physicians. Dr. Eugene Cohen of New York lectured the president in November 1961, "You cannot be permitted to receive therapy from irresponsible doctors like Max Jacobson." Dr. Hans Krauss warned Kennedy, "No president with his finger on the red button has any business taking stuff like that." Frustrated by the snubs, Jacobson handed Kennedy a letter offering to end his services. The president laughed and said, "That's out of the question," Jacobson recalled. The FBI and CIA kept files on Jacobson. Bobby Kennedy tried to get rid of him, fearing amphetamine side effects of an exaggerated sense of power and even slow death by poisoning. Bobby asked government labs to analyze vials of Jacobson's medicine. Reports conflict on whether the labs found amphetamines or whether they reported there was not enough medicine for a proper assessment. In any case, President Kennedy told Bobby, "I don't care if it's horse piss. It works." At the Palm Beach house on November 3, 1963, Jacobson saw Kennedy for the last time, finding his #1 patient in good spirits about his coming trip to Texas. The doctor went off with Radziwill on a safari to Bechuanaland, southern Africa. Jacobson was devastated as he watched televised news in New York of Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. From her boarding school in Massachusetts, Jill Jacobson frantically called her father, fearing that he had been with Kennedy.
I somehow surmised in my mind that my father had been killed, and I was totally freaked out.
Injections from Jacobson reportedly helped Jackie get through the funeral. When she moved into a Georgetown house with her children, Jacobson continued to see her. Lem Billings got a luncheon invitation from Jackie and encountered the doctor as he was leaving. Billings told Jackie that Max's amphetamines could be addicting, and then he reported to Attorney General Bobby Kennedy that he had seen Jacobson at the house.
Bobby went ballistic. He telephoned Jacobson's office in New York and warned the good doctor to stay away from his sister-in-law. "If you show up again," Bobby told him, I'll see to it that you never practice medicine again. Lem Billings.
In May 1964, Mark Shaw dedicated his best-selling book of Kennedy family photos to Jacobson. He inscribed on the doctor's copy the cryptic message, "For only he understands, and time puts all in true perspective." Shaken by Kennedy's death, Jacobson suffered a harder blow in May 1964 when Nina died under clouded circumstances at age 49 after 23 years of marriage.
Absolutely suddenly. I had no idea she was even sick. I had sent my mother a telegram, Happy Mother's Day, and I don't even know if that was delivered to her because my father posted Anna Chalsov, his nurse, to stay with my mother. And then when she was rushed to the hospital, he wouldn't let me see her.
Her death notice requested donations to Jacobson's Constructive Research Foundation for his work on tissue regeneration therapy. Doris Shapiro suggested, based on a talk with Beatrice Moore, Jacobson's receptionist and Nina's best friend, that Nina may well have died after a botched injection by her husband, but no autopsy was done and questions still linger. Lerner, lyricist of Camelot and classmate of Jack Kennedy, denied fourth wife Micheline's divorce allegations that he was hooked on speed. "Max just makes me feel good," Lerner told Doris Shapiro, who became a patient too. Lerner, Shapiro, and Jacobson were thrown together for weeks in Boston in 1965 during tryouts of Lerner's musical On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, written with Burton Lane. Lerner had a suite at the Ritz-Carlton but stayed on a yacht in Boston Harbor. In rehearsals at the Colonial Theater, Jacobson was a constant presence. After Nina's death, he had let himself go, no longer trim. Lynn Daroff Lane, Burton Lane's wife, told the New York Times that during a rehearsal, Jacobson had pointed to his PT 109 tie clasp and bragged that he had treated Jack and Jackie Kennedy. "They never could have made it without me," he said. "They gave me this in gratitude." Lerner and Lane decided to replace Louis Jourdan as the musical's male lead. Secretly, they summoned singer John Cullum to Boston and prepared him to take over. Today, Cullum and his wife, Emily Frankel, remember the bizarre atmosphere surrounding the show.
We were sneaked into Alan J. Lerner's suite. It was a huge suite. But the phone kept ringing, and people kept calling, desperately asking for Alan or for Max, Dr. Max. All over the room, there were vials. I'm talking about little vials. And sure, everybody spoke about their appointments with Dr. Max. Some injections that gave them creative or emotional energy. Was it speed? It certainly kept people working for 24-hour periods without sleep. I found this whole thing very spooky. And we didn't go to Dr. Max for injections, so...
I'm glad I didn't. You didn't, did you?
No!
Doris Shapiro, her marriage to her husband Bert in trouble, wrote that she had a tryst with Jacobson at the Ritz-Carlton, and she wanted much more.
I was supposed to marry Max. Max was guiding society toward the good, and my place was to be grandly by his side in some queen capacity.
I'm not going to say she was delusional. My father was more into his office and experimenting with all the medicines than with any woman.
Dr. Max was still on the upswing. That medal he got for public service in 1966 at the Panamanian Embassy in London came from Eusebio Morales, Panama's ambassador to the UK and the UN, a patient and friend. Bob Richardson, the photographer and patient, said fans of Jacobson came to the medal ceremony from all over Europe for Max's shots. Theater folk kept coming. Stars like Kay Thompson, actress and author of the Eloise books. Her friend Marty Stevens said she went to Max once.
I wound up on the ceiling, and I didn't get down for 3 days. I've never been so frightened in my life. But everybody went there. Jack Kennedy, Jackie, Dietrich, the whole bunch. He got everybody hooked.
After the deaths of Kennedy and Nina Jacobson, Max Jacobson's drug-making methods in his unlicensed backroom lab became even more unorthodox. He doubled down on his faith in electromagnetic fields, ultrasonic beams, bombarding enzymes with gamma rays, freezing placenta with liquid nitrogen, using eel cells. He placed stones at the bottom of medicine vials that he said were uranium to give the liquid energy. An undercurrent of trouble was rippling under Jacobson's continuing popularity. First, the award-winning avant-garde filmmaker Maya Deren died in 1961 of a brain hemorrhage at age 41. She had been on amphetamines for 20 years, ever since her mentor, Katherine Dunham, had sent her to Jacobson. In January 1963, Eddie Fisher said he observed Jacobson frantically trying to revive an unconscious businessman on an examining table. The patient died at Mount Sinai Hospital of what was diagnosed as a brain hemorrhage. The man's widow sued for malpractice. Jacobson settled the lawsuit. Fisher recalled that he was present when Zero Mostel had a bad reaction to one of Max's shots and collapsed backstage before a Broadway performance. Fisher said he held the frightened Mostel's hand as they waited for Max to arrive. Another shot from the doctor calmed Mostel down. Fisher said, "We thought that Max had saved Zero's life. We didn't focus on the fact that Max's first shot had put him on the floor." Harry Belafonte let Jacobson try to cure eye problems, but furiously blamed the doctor for ruining his show in Puerto Rico with 3 useless and disorienting shots. Anthony Quinn wrote that in 1960 he and his wife were getting several shots from Jacobson every day at $75 a shot. Quinn said his son Duncan enlightened him. He had become a speed freak. Quinn said Jacobson was evil and cunning in trying to stop him from quitting. When Quinn finally refused to pay thousands of dollars he owed, he said, the doctor showed up at the actor's townhouse. As Quinn described what happened next, they quarreled over the bill. Jacobson grabbed a valuable Rodin bust for payment and ran down the street. Quinn gave chase. A cop stopped them. "This man is stealing my head," Quinn said. The cop made Jacobson give the sculpture back.
I don't believe that my father would ever go to anyone's house and grab an artwork for payment. Here's the thing. My father had injected himself with something which he shouldn't have, but he did many years ago. Him and Mark Shaw together. After that time, my father walked with a limp. He could not run anymore.
September 1961, New York Yankees slugger Mickey Mantle complained of a bad cold or virus. Mel Allen, the Yankees announcer, told Mantle he had just the doctor for him. "Man, what he can do," Allen said. Jacobson shot something into Mantle's right hip, too high, hitting bone. Another doctor put Mantle in a hospital and found a deep abscess the size of a golf ball. Mantle was useless for the rest of the season and in the World Series. The Yankees fired Allen in 1964 after 24 years without explanation, but the notorious medical referral to Jacobson was widely cited as the cause. Tennessee Williams collapsed in 1969 after taking Jacobson's mailed vials for 3 years. Williams did not blame Jacobson. He blamed himself for violating the doctor's warnings not to drink alcohol while on the medicine. Williams told the Paris Review in 1981 that he actually did some of his best writing while on Max's drugs.
Dr. Max Jacobson never listened to my heart, never took my pulse, never took my blood pressure. He was really sort of an alchemist. He would look at me for a long time. He had all these little vials in front of him. He'd take a drop from one and a drop from another and look at me again. Of course, the primary element was speed. And after I had a shot, I'd get into a taxi and my heart would begin to pound and I'd immediately have to have a drink or I wouldn't be able to get home. Tennessee Williams.
Now, there's no known serious interaction between amphetamine and alcohol, but there is between barbiturates and alcohol can be fatal. And Max did apparently put barbiturates in some of his concoctions.
Life magazine ran an embarrassing report in 1967 that Eusebio Morales, the Panamanian diplomat who had beribboned Jacobson for merit, was a mafia bagman who had helped the mob skim and launder $75,000 in Las Vegas casino money through the Panama branches of Swiss banks. Then, new federal drug record-keeping laws ensnared Jacobson. In 1968 and 1969, the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs raided his office and seized all controlled drugs in his possession, alleging he could not account for large quantities of narcotics. Questioned by the federal agents about needle marks on his hands, Jacobson admitted injecting himself with 25 milligrams of methamphetamine every 2 or 3 days. He claimed he was a researcher for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, but officials of the society called Jacobson a quack and a charlatan. A powerful patient, Congressman Claude Pepper, tried to intercede. He asked the narcotics officials why they were investigating Jacobson and said he was certain they would find nothing wrong. Pepper invited Jacobson to testify before the House Select Committee on Crime about treating heroin addicts. An even bigger Jacobson supporter than Pepper died alone in his New York apartment in January 1969. Multiplying the doctor's problems, that famous patient was Mark Shaw.
I hated him. Why? Because he would show up at our apartment. My father would not be there. I would be there with my friends or alone, and he would ring the doorbell like a maniac and pound on the door. And he would say, "I've got to see Max, I've got to see Max, where's your father? I'm having a heart attack." And I would look at him and I would say, "You're not having a heart attack, what's going on?"
Because he was addicted.
No, it was that he was working or had to work and needed some treatments. You can't assume that he was on amphetamine.
A man who worked for Shaw found his body on a Sunday morning. The New York Medical Examiner's Office was notified and brought Shaw's body to the morgue just across First Avenue at 30th Street. The doctor was now playing for high stakes.
Jacobson was out of the country, I think, and I get a call from a clerk saying they have a call from a lawyer who insists on talking to a medical examiner about somebody's death. And the lawyer says to me, "I'm the lawyer for Mark Shaw, and I insist that no autopsy be done." A death certificate had already been made. It had been signed out as a heart attack. Somebody from the family had said that. But that lawyer turned out to be Max Jacobson's lawyer. If he had been in the city, he would have been called as Mark Shaw's physician, and he could have then issued the death certificate. That would have been the end of it. Ironically, because the lawyer called, it piqued my interest and wonder what the heck is this about, because that's an unusual request. Then we went down and we looked at the body, and he had very prominent needle track scars on both arms. An autopsy has to be done here. We have to do toxicology. So that night, I did the autopsy. Did not find any evidence of heart disease. And I did find old and needle track scars and some fresh needle punctures. Also, I felt that I had to go look at the scene with any needles or evidence of drug use. Sure enough, there were all these pictures on the wall of President Kennedy. I didn't know who Mark Shaw was. There was somebody there who cleaned out the place of all the needles. I did find a jar, a little bottle that had a needle puncture in the top. A funny little jar which had a little stone in it. I took that. It took many weeks or a month or two before the final diagnosis was made. The final results of toxicology were done. Sure enough, that had a bunch of stuff in it, vitamins, and also amphetamine. So during that time, Max Jacobson had returned from Europe, came to my office, and we sat and we talked for an hour or two. And he indicated he gave him these vials, which he said contained vitamins and other medicines in there. He didn't mention amphetamine. I'm not sure he knew I had one of his vials. I wouldn't necessarily volunteer that to him. He kind of rolled up his sleeves, and he had very prominent needle track scars. he tried to explain to me that was because he took certain medications intravenously, but these are all legitimate medicines. And that's what he said about Mark Shaw. It was his opinion as his treating physician that he died of some natural cause. He thought it was due to a heart disease. And I then issued a cause of death, something like acute and chronic intravenous amphetamine poisoning.
The medical examiner began investigating the deaths of at least 4 other patients of Jacobson. Nothing came of that. A long era of permissiveness was ending. President Richard Nixon's 1970 amendments to the Controlled Substances Act further tightened restrictions on amphetamines. Federal narcotics officials told New York State about Jacobson's handling of the drugs. They slowly started to investigate. The name Dr. Feelgood broke into print with a February 1971 story in New York Magazine. It was writer Susan Wood's account of undercover visits several years earlier to 3 Manhattan celebrity speed doctors, identified only as Doctors A, B, and C. Clearly, Jacobson was Dr. C. Susan Wood said that her intermediary with Dr. C threatened that powerful people could kill her story and wreck her career if she was tough on the doctor. That intermediary plainly was Mark Shaw. Dr. A. Alois Warren in June 1971 was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for running a no-questions-asked amphetamine pill supermarket. Doctors in New Jersey and Long Island were prosecuted. Dr. Max Jacobson remarried in 1972, with authorities and the news media closing in. That August, FBI Acting Director L. Patrick Gray got a tip from the Narcotics Bureau that the New York Times and syndicated columnist Jack Anderson were asking questions about Jacobson, whose arrest was said by a Times reporter to be imminent. It was an election year, and Kennedy biographer Richard Reeves had tipped the Times political desk that Vice President Spiro Agnew might be seeing Jacobson. The newspaper eventually mounted a task force of 12 reporters and a researcher, led by Boyce Rensberger and physician Lawrence K. Altman.
And we started looking into Max at that time and could not find any clue that Agnew was involved. But we did discover all these other wonderful, famous people who were much more interesting than Agnew.
Who made it clear that this was a hell of a story.
There were deaths involved, and that, of course, piqued our interest even more. Interviews in his office, he was very cooperative, not defensive. We did go to his apartment. It was in a nice building on the Upper East Side, but it was not a very fancy place at all, not huge. We were starting to push him a little bit on whether he knew what he was doing or not, and he did become, he began to tense up a little bit, and then he excused himself. And he went off to the bathroom. He came back and he sat down, and I could see on the back of his hand where the blood vessels cross over here that there was a little drop of blood on the hand. He then seemed to regain his confidence and composure and so on. We figured he must have gone in and shot himself up again. He needed a little pick-me-up or something during the interview.
The kickoff article was a blockbuster. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis crisply acknowledged having been a patient. Capote called Jacobson a powerful theatrical figure who might have caused him to collapse in Europe. Otto Preminger regretted going to Jacobson. "I'll never go again," he said. The Times concluded that only a few patients took enough speed to lead to reliance. Most, the newspaper found, took the drug only now and then to get up for special occasions or to get through difficult stretches. Interviewed, Jacobson raised eyebrows in defending his methods. He denied that amphetamine was addictive, like heroin or morphine. He said disenchanted patients were mentally unstable or drank against his orders. He said Mark Shaw died not from speed or from heart disease, but from a blow to the head that caused asphyxiation from inhaled vomit, a new assertion that pathologist Michael Bodden contradicted to Times reporters. Reacting to the story, Jacobson said it contained too many inaccuracies and distortions to detail. He insisted that in small amounts under close supervision, amphetamines can be a valuable tool for a doctor. Dakin Williams phoned the Times to confirm amphetamine's devastating effects on his brother Tennessee. The playwright himself wrote to refute a statement by Jacobson's assistant that he once was thrown out of the office for showing up drunk with a bottle. Williams called Jacobson a brilliant experimenter with humanitarian motives, but said the experiments in his case involved a good deal of hazard. The Times kept the pressure on. In a follow-up story, the brothers of Milton Blackstone, once a famous and savvy talent manager, charged that Jacobson's shots had reduced the man to a shambling derelict. Blackstone, however, remained loyal to the doctor he called more than a friend. Next, a Times article on the growing issue of speed, and then a second expose of celebrity speed doctors, this time Robert Freeman and John Bishop. Manhattan's so-called Dr. Feelgoods were under sustained attack.
Am I angry at them for it? No, I guess they're doing their job. I don't know.
Under the spotlight, New York State's halting probe of Max Jacobson raced ahead under fresh momentum.
There's no question that our story kicked them into action again, and they started doing a lot more investigating.
Less than 4 months after the first story in the Times, the State Board of Medicine petitioned to revoke Jacobson's medical license. He was charged with 11 counts of professional misconduct, 1 count of fraud or deceit in the practice of medicine. Only 1 count related to amphetamines. The others alleged illicit drug making and poor record keeping.
He was so busy taking care of patients and making his own injectables, he didn't have time, and also he'd have to hire somebody to do all that.
Jacobson scoffed at the charges. He told daughter Jill, "I've been in practice for 40 years. What do they know?" And so the hearings began before a panel of 5 physicians, 19 closed sessions over 14 months around Midtown Manhattan. Jacobson's tenacious lawyer, Simon Rose of the famous Louis Nizer firm, presented what one state official called one of the best prepared defenses we've ever had. Most of the more than 90 witnesses were former Jacobson patients, pro and con. His defense witnesses included Katherine Dunham and Betty Cashman, a prominent acting coach. Otto Preminger volunteered as a witness for the prosecutor, John Walber of the State Attorney General's office. Eddie Fisher's testimony was ambivalent. He said he considered Jacobson a vital and fascinating character, had been close to the doctor he once had called Miracle Max and still My God. But Fisher claimed he would tell Jacobson he felt great after the speed shots only because the doctor would yell and scream otherwise. Fisher said he would go to another doctor whenever he had something seriously wrong with him. Dr. Michael Baden, a prosecution witness, recalls the crucial nature of one hotly contested question, whether amphetamines caused the death of Mark Shaw.
If Shaw hadn't died, if it hadn't been called amphetamine poisoning, they would not have had a basis to investigate his license. Rarely do doctors lose their license, in my experience, just for bad medicine. Because, it's their own opinion about things.
On February 25, 1975, the panel declared Jacobson guilty on all counts. Citing him for serious and inexcusable misconduct, the tribunal said it was wrong to give speed in doses 10 times the professional average just to help people work longer hours, and wrong for the doctor to inject himself. The panel rejected his position that the drug becomes harmless when mixed with vitamins. The doctors decided Jacobson did nothing for his MS patients. They called his office filthy and his homemade drugs adulterated. Recommendation to the State Board of Regents: revoke Max Jacobson's license after some 39 years of practice in New York. On April 11, 1975, the case went up for hearing before the 3-member Regents Committee on Discipline in Albany. This committee also unanimously recommended removing Jacobson from practice. The 15-member Board of Regents agreed, unanimously voting revocation only 2 weeks after the Albany hearing. That was not the end of the story for the New York Times. Articles continued, one calling Jacobson perhaps the best-known example of an unfit doctor. Stung into action, the New York County Medical Society expelled Robert Freeman for amphetamine malpractice the same year Jacobson was sanctioned. Defending his nickname, Freeman wrote a book titled What's So Bad About Feeling Good? Dr. John Bishop quietly moved to the country town of Sag Harbor, Long Island. Jacobson regained fitness with 30 laps a day in his apartment building's swimming pool. He visited relatives in Europe and California. He worked on his memoirs. In 1978, he retained lawyer Irving Alter and moved to get his license back. He failed and remained barred from his lifetime profession. By then, he was 79.
I think justice was done in revoking his license. It was slow justice.
Only 6 months later, Max Jacobson died of prostate cancer. There was no death notice in the New York Times. His grave is at Mount Hebron Cemetery in the New York City borough of Queens.
Catherine Dunham had her own opinion, which I totally disagree with. She thought that he had a way of doing himself in that nobody would find out about, and that he just couldn't live anymore not being able to treat patients.
Conflicting opinions continue about a man whose rise and dramatic fall could be rated as a personal tragedy with parallels to that of his most famous patient, John F. Kennedy. From Margaret O'Leary, a physician and researcher.
Max Jacobson was a dangerous fraud enabled by the times in which he lived.
From the late Doris Shapiro.
Max was not a simple charlatan. He had about him a symptom of greatness, but he was corrupt to the core.
I've forgotten all about that Dr. Feelgood problem he got into. He helped me. I admired him very much. He was a profound influence on my life.
He's a very caring, creative, energetic, but certainly unconventional figure. And as I said before, sort of larger than life. And ultimately, the view of him as just a Dr. Feelgood and some sort of quack, or worse, is very unfair, very unfair.
He was a mad scientist, he was a quack, he was a caring physician who really did care about his patients, but who let his carelessness, his ability to take big chances in treating patients, he let those things push him too far and to treat patients in ways that were very bad for them ultimately. It could be the headstrongness of a person on amphetamines who feels that there is no obstacle that can stop them.
The late Eddie Fisher in an audio book, Ambivalent to the End.
Even now, even knowing the damage Max did, I still don't believe he intended to hurt anyone. He believed completely in what he was doing. All we saw were the results. How could anyone that made me feel so good be bad? Those of us who believed in Max didn't understand the danger. And once we understood it, we didn't believe it. And once we believed it, we didn't care.